Ever since British tanks were added to War Thunder, we have been given a wide variety of British vehicles from the interwar period all the way to the modern day, allowing players to experience nearly every British tank that was used by Britain or its allies. However, there is one glaring omission to the British tech tree that has never been fixed, that being British Cold War light tanks, or a lack of them, meaning Britain is missing out on some very important vehicles. However, in the dev blog for the T90 Bhishma that was released in the recent Sons of Attila update, we were given a statement by Gaijin where they tell us that they are actively working on IFVs and light tanks for Britain, though unfortunately we are not given any firm dates. So in this video we will be taking a look at the British Cold War light tanks that could be added to War Thunder, how I think they will play, and also touch upon why I think it has taken Gaijin so long to actually get around to adding these tanks. Just a quick note before we start, when looking at British Cold War light tanks, it must be remembered that most of these are based on the Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tract, or CVRT, family of vehicles, which has already provided us with the FV-102 Striker in the British tank destroyer lineup, and so helpfully most of these tanks will be relatively easy to add because they are very similar to each other, with their main differences coming about in their main armaments. For our first tank we'll start off with the FV-101 Scorpion light tank, that attended service with the British Army in 1972 and would go on to serve in the Falklands and First Gulf War, and was eventually retired in 1994. Now, like I say, this does share stats with most of the other British light tanks, so helpfully most of the stats I'm going to cover here also apply to the later tanks, so I will try and avoid duplicating some of these stats and only mentioning the ones that are different from the Scorpion. But basically, as a light tank, it is understandably very fast, having a top speed of 50 miles per hour or 80.5 kilometers an hour, which is a blisteringly fast speed, allowing it to quickly get around the battlefield, ambush enemies and escape before they can respond, as well as of course making it an extremely useful tank for reconnaissance work. It should be noted that the initial petrol engine does seem to have been swapped out for a diesel engine later on, which might affect the top speed of the Scorpions, and if this is the case I would suggest adding it with the petrol engine, as those top speeds are just going to be a blast in game and I don't think we should miss out on having them. Also, quick note, supposedly it holds the Guinness World Record for the fastest production tank, achieving a speed of 51.1 miles per hour or 82.2 kilometers an hour on a test track back in 2002. The Guinness World Records website itself doesn't seem to have it listed, though perhaps as it was an older record it was simply removed from the website at some point. Unfortunately, in order to achieve this mobility, sacrifices have had to be made with regards to armour thickness, which is only made of aluminium alloy, which provides less protection than regular armour. And the two figures I've heard is 12.7mm maximum thickness, the other is that it provides protection against a maximum of 12.7mm machine gun fire. The Striker in-game, which uses the same CVRT chassis, has 25mm maximum thickness and is well sloped, which does pair up for the protection against heavy machine gun fire, as it can't really stop anything above autocannon fire, and so is extremely vulnerable to anything above machine gun fire. It is also fitted with smoke dischargers, which of course can help hide the Scorpion from enemy fire. Now moving on to the armament, the Scorpion was armed with the Royal Ordnance 76mm L23A1, which was developed from the similar but heavier L5A1 as used on the Saladin armoured car, and it is capable of 35 degrees of elevation and 10 degrees of depression, though unfortunately it uses manual traverse, so turning and aiming the turret will likely be slow work, and it has the capacity to carry 40 shells for the main gun. Now you might assume being a 76mm gun it will pack quite a punch, but this isn't exactly the case, as the L23 has a low muzzle velocity, maxing out at around 533 meters a second, with its only anti-tank shell being a HESH shell, which according to Repaircraft plc, a company that supplies shells for the gun, it is effective against up to 80mm RHA plate, while Jane's Ammunition Handbook gives a figure of 90mm. Of course, the unique pancaking effect of HESH shells will mean that when they hit their targets, it results in them being unaffected by the sloping of armour, so it would be able to penetrate up to 90mm of armour at any inclination, making it a deadly threat to tanks like the Panther, T-34-85 and M4 Sherman, all of which rely on sloping rather than thick armour for protection. though more heavily armoured tanks like the Tiger 1 will require flanking to deal with, and even this might not be enough to deal with some tanks. In addition to the Hess shell, the Scorpion can also fire HE, smoke, illumination and canister shells, though these will likely be of limited utility in game, while a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun can be used against unarmoured targets. The crew of the Scorpion is free, consisting of a driver in the hull with the gunner and commander in the turret, which does give a little bit of redundancy in the case of losing one crew member, but it wouldn't take much damage to lose more than one crewman and thus the whole tank. In War Thunder, I can't see it ranking too highly in its battle rating, with 6.0 probably being a decent place for it to be, as it will not have much trouble against some tanks like the T-34 or Panther, but would really struggle against Tigers, Pershings and IS-2s, while many World War II and Cold War tanks will be all but immune to its Hess shell, which would limit its effectiveness in the higher tiers depending on what tanks you go against, as a German Leopard 1 would still be vulnerable, but a Soviet T-54 would be very difficult to destroy. Of course, 6.0 would lead to it playing against World War II tanks, which as many of you who watch will know is something I am firmly against, but I just can't see it performing very well in the higher battle ratings, so I think an exception would have to be made here. As for its placement on the tech tree, I would suggest placing it between the Avenger and FV4005, which might seem like a bit of an odd place to put it, but the only other place I could see it going is between the Churchill Mark 7 and Charioteer Mark 7. And since the Warrior IFV is already in the tank destroyer line, I think it makes more sense for it to go there personally. Though really we might need some major redesigns of the tech tree as a whole when the light tanks are brought in. In addition to the regular Scorpion armed with the 76mm gun, there was also another minor variant called the Scorpion 90, which was armed with the 90mm Mark III Cockerill gun, which in-game has a penetration of 250mm with Heat FS shells, or 102mm with Hess shells, which is far more powerful than the previous 76mm gun. It is also a little bit slower with a top speed of 45 miles per hour or 76.5 kilometers an hour, primarily due to the increased weight of the gun. Though this is still a pretty good speed, and I think the more powerful main armament more than makes up for any loss of speed. However, this vehicle was for the export market and wasn't used by the British Army, so potentially it wouldn't be added to the British tech tree. Maybe it could be added as a premium, though if it was added as a regular vehicle, I would folder it with the regular Scorpion tank at a battle rating of 6.7. The next major light tank is the FV-107 Scimitar, which entered service in 1974 and saw service in the Falklands War, Afghanistan, both Gulf Wars, and was only retired in this year, which is 2023 if you're watching this in the future. Despite serving for far longer, it is almost identical to the Scorpion, with the main difference being it has a new main armament consisting of a 30mm L21A1 Radan autocannon, which despite being a smaller calibre is a much more capable anti-tank weapon compared to the low velocity 76mm gun of the Scorpion, with its APDS round having an in-game penetration of 95mm at 500 metres and 101mm at 100 metres. Though its stock SAP-I rounds only have a penetration of 50mm at 100 metres, which would be of limited effectiveness and possibly it would just need its APDS rounds from the start to make up for this. Being an autocannon, it has a fast fire rate of 80 rounds a minute, which admittedly is slower than some other nations' autocannons, but is far faster than that of the 76mm gun of the Scorpion, making it much better for drawn-out engagements. In addition to the 30mm cannon, it still retains the 7.62mm coaxial machine gun, armour, speed and 3-man complement of the Scorpion light tank, meaning anyone who has played the Scorpion should have little trouble adjusting to the Scimitar. I would personally suggest adding it at around battle rating 7.3 to 7.7, which is similar to the BTR-80A at 7.3, as that vehicle has an inferior APDS round but stronger stock APT rounds. So I think it would be a good battle rating for the Scimitar to be added at. As for placement on the tech tree, again it would be a little bit tricky, but I would suggest placing it between the Tortoise and Swingfire, again in the tank destroyer line, which I know is a bit of a weird placement, but one brought about due to there not really being a logical place for light tanks to be added in the current tank lines. There was also a Mark II of the Scimitar that was given some improved armour, but I personally can't see this vehicle being too much of an improvement over the original Mark 1. Though of course I think it should still be added, and maybe it could be added at a slightly higher battle rating depending on how good the upgrades are. A mention should also be given to the Sabre and FV432/30, with the Sabre being a combination of the Scorpion's chassis and the turret of the Fox armoured car, while the FV432/30 is a combination of the FV432 APC chassis and again fitted with the Fox armoured car's turret. Unfortunately, this turret is still armed with the 30mm Radan autocannon, so it would essentially play the same as the Scimitar, and of course while I think they should still be added, even as a premium if needed, they should definitely not be a high priority compared to the Scimitar itself. So this list of vehicles covers most of the unique major British light tanks of the Cold War period, and overall I think these would be a good fit for War Thunder. There are also a few armoured cars that could be added, namely the Saladin and aforementioned Fox, but these do have the disadvantage of being very similar to the light tanks in many ways. For example, the Saladin is armed with practically the same weapon as the Scorpion, and fires the same ammunition with the same penetration stats, while also having the same crew and being slightly slower. While the Fox armoured car has the same armament as the Scimitar, and although it is slightly faster, it would again play pretty similarly to the Scimitar light tank. I would still like to see them added in at some point, and I will definitely cover them in more depth in the future, but I feel the priority should be to add the British light tanks. While researching this topic, I think I've also come across the main reason Gaijin hasn't really bothered to add British light tanks, and I think it's primarily due to the South African subtree. I mean, you only need to take a quick glance at their subtree to see that most South African armoured cars are just straight up superior to most of the light tanks we've looked at today. For example, the Ratel 90 at 6.0 has a superior gun and speed to both variants of the Scorpion and the Saladin, while the Ratel 20 has an inferior 20mm cannon compared to the Scimitar, but it also comes with anti-tank guided missiles, arguably making it superior or at worst equivalent to the Scimitar light tank and Fox armoured car, while the Eland and the Roycat are also superior in most aspects. And these vehicles will all be serving in the same tiers and battle ratings that the British light tanks will be serving at. This can even be seen in the lower tiers, where the South African armoured cars like the SARCs and Concept 3 are again superior or equivalent to most early British armoured cars and light tanks. In my opinion, this led to Gaijin deciding that there was little need to prioritise adding the British light tanks and armoured cars, as the South African subtree gave Britain access to far superior vehicles, which would very quickly overshadow their British counterparts in the event of them being added. That said, I do have some hope we might see a change in this view, as there is clearly some demand for British light tanks to be added, and as time goes on there will be less and less British Cold War vehicles to add, so just by process of elimination there will eventually be a tipping point where it just makes sense to add these vehicles to the British tech tree. Anyway, this was just a quick look at the British Cold War light tanks. I will also do a video looking at the various British armoured cars that need adding, but this will be at a later date and I do still need to do some more research on them. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video looking at British Cold War light tanks. Hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.